Bueller?
He's sick. My best friend's sister's boyfriend's brother's girlfriend heard from this guy who knows this kid is going with the girl who saw Ferris pass out at 31 Flavors last night. I guess it's pretty serious.
Thank you, Simone.
No problem whatsoever.
Bueller?
I do want to say welcome to the third lesson for Comics Writing 101 here on Thinking Critical YouTube. I've got our wonderful teachers here today. We've got Mr. Mark Pellegrini, Mr. Aaron Sparrow. Obviously, Mark has done a lot of crowdfunded comic book work, done the Common America series, Black Hops. How you doing, Mark?
Doing good.
And next up, we've got Aaron Sparrow. I'm not going to mess it up this time. The man behind Darkwing Duck, some of the Tokyopop adaptations, was also the head editor at Boom Studios on their Boom Kids line when they had the Disney license. So worked on a lot of big profile projects in the past. How you doing, Aaron?
I'm doing great.
Well, I'm glad you guys could make it. Now, obviously, there are many ways to skin a cat. There's no real set in stone format for comic book scripts within the industry. From what I understand, you just kind of find the one that works for you. You adapt it to yourself and your artist, and you kind of run with it. Mark, is there anything people should keep in mind? You know, we've got the brainstorming out of the way. We've done our paginations. We've got our outline ready, and we're ready to start writing our story and scripting it, breaking it down. What should people keep in mind before they actually start putting pen to paper for the script?
Well, I mean, you've already gotten what I consider to be the nuts and bolts, the really important stuff done. You've got your summary, you've done your page breakdowns, and once you've done your page breakdowns, the paginations, etc., you know what's going to be on each page of your script. So just at least from my perspective, the script part's honestly a lot easier and more fun because the foundation's already built and I already know what I'm going to put in each page. But the important thing to remember, and you mentioned it, is to work with your artist before you start scripting to find out the kinds of scripts that work best with them. You want to collaborate with them. The kind of scripting that's intuitive to their art style. If they necessarily want you to put in lots of panel details, I consider the dialogue like a must because that dialogue really helps control not just the flow of the conversation, but also to infer the attitude and expression of the characters. You know, if the artist knows what the character is yelling or saying, they can infer what the character's emotion is. But definitely, you know, if you're working with a lot of different artists, you know, then each artist is going to have their own preference on the kinds of scripts that work best with them. I work almost entirely with Tim. So Tim and I have our rapport, and so that works for me because I have my scripting style. It was tailored to fit the way Tim likes to draw, so I don't really have to adjust my scripting style when I write comics anymore. But for somebody who works with a lot of different artists, you always want to communicate with your artist first to find out what works with them.
So, Aaron, obviously, you were the editor at Boom. I imagine you weren't just working with a lot of different artists. You were working with a lot of different writers. Was there one set standard at Boom while you were in charge?
Well, you know, the nice thing was we kind of had, you know, a certain script format that people followed. You know, I think that you're going to put up an example in a bit from Jeff Johns. Basically, my scripts kind of like, I had a set style, and then when I got Green Lantern Rebirth and they put Johns' scripts in the backs, I went through and I kind of like pulled things that I liked from his scripts, and then that kind of became a standard format script that we would send out to new writers and say, like, you know, your script needs to look something like this. You know, obviously there was room for variation, but, you know, please kind of keep it to this format. And everybody was kind of like already on that page. So even though there's no set way to do a comic book script, you know, there's no standard format generally that you get in the industry. We did have, you know, artists and writers kind of like arriving at it organically. And then when they would be sent a script sample, you know, and sometimes we would just use John's script exactly, like, you know, please give it into a format, us into a format like this. This is kind of what your artist expects to see. You know, people would follow it, and it's really easy and really really intuitive the way that it's laid out. So you know, we would send that out to artists, and you know, we would send it out to our writers so they knew what to deliver. But yeah, in working with different artists, there's different things that are tailored to them. So as an editor, you know, I would often talk with my artists and be like, okay, well, what do you want to draw? You know, what are there things that you want to avoid? You know, some things you won't be able to because they're going to be required for the script. But you know, what do you feel like your strengths are? What do you feel like your weaknesses are? And then the writer could kind of write to that.
So is there anything else like just you think people should be prepared for before we get into this example script format that we have from Jeff Johns and kind of get into the things that he adds in there that you think if you're ready for your script, these are the things that you might not have remembered that you needed to have ready before you go?
No, I think we can jump right into it. I mean, we already covered having your storyline, knowing your ending, kind of the direction that you're going, knowing your impactful beginning. So I think that we can probably jump into the nuts and bolts of the actual script itself, because if people have watched the previous series, I think they're probably pretty caught up at this point. I can't think of anything to add. How about you, Mark?
No, I think we're pretty much ready to go in. We already discussed that there's no academic style for comic book scripting. It's not like a screenplay format or a manuscript format. So just to have a good visual aid like that Jeff Johns one you showed us before he started, that's a good place to start.
So we'll do that, and then afterwards we will talk a little bit about the Marvel method, which is obviously widely known within the industry, but it definitely differs from what we're looking at here. So this is a sample script from Green Lantern #1 from Jeff Johns. I think it was pretty in depth. I kind of like what he did here. Some of the interesting things that I noticed right away in the beginning, he has a lot of references as far as information, and you can see that there's going to be scenes that are happening at Edwards Air Force Base. So he gives you a link. If you can go in there, you can see what the base outline is going to look like. You're going to have flight suits. Obviously, you're going to have pilots. This is what a flight suit looks like. These are the planes that are supposed to be in the script. These are examples kind of what you should be looking at to include as far as the visuals. Is this something that you include in your scripts for Tim?
So references are really important. I don't do it that way, though. I don't include like just a bibliography essentially at the beginning of the script. I see the reference images and the reference links out where they apply throughout the script. So if I have a reference image for a location, I'll either include a link to an image gallery for that location, or I'll just embed the image directly in the Word file, which you can do. You can just copy and paste it in there. And that just makes it easier for Tim, so he doesn't have to try and go back to a previous page and try to look up the corresponding reference image himself. Just having it right there on the page, I think it's just a bit more helpful to him than just having a bibliography like that. But it is always good to have your reference material included with the script. Yeah, that's basically what it comes down to.
So Aaron,
I agree with Mark. I do it the same way. I insert it within the script itself, at the appropriate page and the appropriate time. That's where I'll put the links and things like that of reference material. Just because, for Solani or even like the artist I was working with at Boom, it just, as they get to that page, that's when they really need to think about it.
So Aaron, how far can you mess up the production cycle of a comic book when you have your script done, but you don't have proper references for what you want to see? Is it going to take the time for the artist, or is he just going to go find something that he thinks you want?
Yeah, that's the danger. Is if you have a very specific, if you're just kind of freewheeling it, and you're going to let your artist, just work the way that he wants to, and you can say like, oh, I need flight suits. Here's just some generic flight suits, or you don't give him any reference at all. Then the risk that you're running is that your artist is going to go, okay, and he's going to go try to figure out what you want. If you give them the reference, that's very helpful to them. Plus, it saves them the time of having to go through and search and decide. They have the most intensive schedule. You can crank out a script much faster than an artist can draw a book. So, you need to help them wherever you can, because most artists can only put out like one book a month. And if you're making them do a lot of research and do a lot of, looking around online, your book's not going to look as good, and it's going to take longer.
So yeah, I mean, this is your job. And if you're putting it on your artist, then you're not doing your job. And I think that's also what engenders a lot of the, the combative attitudes in some of the industry between artist and writer. There are a lot of artists who don't think the writers are doing the proper amount of work they should be doing. And so if you can make it easier on your artist, if you can do your job by providing, reference material like that, it'll also help give you a better reputation among the comics industry, the comic circles as a writer, and it'll have an artist who will want to work with you again. And yeah, like Aaron said, like if you don't provide the correct reference material that matches your vision, and you just expect the artist to figure it out. They're not going to be able to read your mind. And you have this example here from a Jeff Johns comic, Green Lantern #1. That's interesting that he has all those references there for locations, because there's a Jeff Johns comic that I recall very vividly. It was one of his issues on his run during The Flash, and it was the issue that had the origin of Hunter Zolomon, the character who became Zoom. And the reason I remember it is because part of Hunter Zolomon's origin was that he studied criminal justice at George Mason University in Northern Virginia. I lived in Fairfax County, Northern Virginia, where George Mason University is. My comic shop was right across the street from George Mason University. It was University Mall. And the campus that the artist drew, I don't have the artist's name on me right now, was not George Mason University campus. It was a completely fabricated, made-up, generic college campus. So it had like a big clock tower, a big bell tower in it. It was surrounded by all these trees and everything. It had like ivy all over the buildings, and it looked nothing like George Mason University campus. So obviously most people would notice that, but someone like me who, his comic shop was right across the street from George Mason University, I immediately, they didn't use any reference material for that.
There's
Kind of took you out of the story.
Yeah.
There's a great joke in Sam and Max, a comic book by Steve Purcell, which if you haven't read it, I definitely recommend it if you can find it. It's one of the biggest influences on me as a creator, where they said, well, it looks like this case is taking us to the Philippines. And the very next panel, Sam is saying, well, here we are in the Philippines. And it's just a bunch of like huts, and there's lightning bolts coming out of them, and there's like a eyeball like decoration over one of them, and Max says, drawn without any reference material apparently.
Yeah, I remember that one.
So let's get a little bit further into this script. So here at the beginning, before we obviously get into the panels and everything, he gives a pretty good idea, like just a 2-line synopsis of whatever the book's about. Then he starts talking about the supporting cast and breaks down who they are, like what their background is, kind of where they're coming from, what their specialties are, so the artist knows who these people are. Is this something that you include as well, Aaron?
Well, I've worked mostly with James Silvani most recently, so I don't really do this anymore because he, when I was working with him, he knew all the characters. I didn't have to do this breakdown. But as from an editorial standpoint, I would do this on occasion because you never knew when you were going. Like I would insert this into writer scripts if they didn't provide it, because you never knew what artist you were going to have on the book from time to time, because you have people drop out, you have people who have family tragedies, there's things where they can't complete a book that they're on, and you have to switch off to another artist. So those things become very helpful. And also, like, let's say you're in the middle of, like, if you're on issue 3 of a book and your artist drops out and you have to bring in a new artist, it helps to give them like in this breakdown where you would give them the different characters, then you would want to link to images of the characters as the previous artist drew them, so that you have that continuity. There's nothing that drives me nuts more than when I'm reading a book, like, a Marvel book, and, Marvel, their continuity has just, they don't have any anymore. It's just kind of out the window. Characters are inconsistent from issue to issue and book to book, and their looks are different. And you'll have a book where, the artist has dropped out because Marvel's not paying them enough, or, they get a better gig, or, for whatever reason. And then they just bring in another artist, and it's obviously done very quickly. And that artist apparently has not been given any reference material from the previous issue. So even though you ended on the middle of a scene in issue 2, now you're in issue 3, and the characters are wearing different clothes, or that, it's a different setting, and it's obvious that, the editor didn't do their job. So it is really important to do things like this if you're working under those kind of conditions.
So, Aaron, it seems to me this would be pretty important if the artist wasn't really familiar with the characters and their relationships, so that you're not depicting them incorrectly. Like here in Captain Jillian Cowgirl Perlman, very end, she sees Hal as just another flyboy, and she's the only female on base that does. So you wouldn't want that character kind of ogling Hal Jordan or leering at him, because that's not their relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and your artist needs all of that, especially if you're switching, you're handing off the baton mid-story.
Obviously, Mark, you and Tim essentially work together exclusively. Is this something that you need to include, like maybe if you have a new character that Tim hasn't drawn before, just to jog his memory on what you're doing with them?
So like this kind of material is stuff that you would write up during like the first 2 videos we did. This is all like pre-scripting material. If you're a creator hiring an artist, like a freelance artist, to draw your comic for you. They're not a co-creator of your work necessarily, but they are the person you're hiring to draw the work for you, then yes, you would want to supply all of this reference material to them. With Tim and I, because we are co-collaborators and we create everything together, he knows who the characters are as well as I do. When I come up with a new idea that I pitch to him, then I do this character Bible material. Like for Black Ops, we have all these ideas for new members of the Black Ops team, the animals and their handlers, and members of the villain team called Cryptic, the terrorists and their monsters. And so I have this pitch Bible that I write up of just these character biographies and summaries for potential characters that we may use down the line that I do share with Tim to show, like, these are my ideas. These are the kinds of characters we can use maybe in the future. And then he gives... if he sees ones that he likes or he sees potential in, then we go back and forth and we adjust them and work on them. And for like Common America, we have other villains and future arcs that we're going to use. And I wrote these write-ups on them and backstories. And then Tim and I have been workshopping those for the next storyline. So we have, if you're a writer and your artist is your collaborator directly and you work, in tandem on your project, you probably don't need to include that because obviously your artist is going to know everything that you do because you've been working together to develop the characters in the world from the beginning. But if you're hiring out and finding a freelance artist to draw your creative project for you, then yes, you want to give them as much reference material as you possibly can.
And there's specifically a note in this script that says, so-and-so is handling the first 5 pages of the art in this book, and then there's another artist coming on. So if you want some continuity between the artists as far as the characters, you're probably going to need to do this if you're working with more than one artist. Here he gets into the settings. Basically, we're going to have scenes taking place on Air Force Base, Coast City, and Hal Jordan's apartment, kind of breaking those down. There's also some color notes. I imagine that's going to be pretty key. Do you need this kind of material, Mark? I imagine with being so close with Tim, you might not even need to get this detail.
I mean, for things like color notes, stuff like that, I mean, I leave that up to Tim because he's also the colorist and the artist, the visual cues like that. If I have a specific idea for, like, I would like a certain effect for a certain scene, but that I will include like the reference material for it. Like, hey, can you light it like it's a Mario Baba movie? And then I'll have like screen caps so he knows what I'm talking about for the colors, or like make it look like Dario Argento's Suspiria in this panel or in this page sequence. And I'll show him something like that with stark blacks and reds, a kind of thing. But for the most part, again, that's something that Tim, the artist, comes up with. But that's why reference material is really important, is that if you are working with an artist and they're not necessarily going to know what the heck you're talking about, like, I don't think Tim's ever seen an Argento or a Baba movie in his life, but if I give him screen caps and I embed them in the script and he can look at them and see what I'm talking about, then he'll get the gist of it.
How many times, Mark, do you put something in the script like that where you give them like a color note, like make it look like an Argento film, and then the book comes out and like nobody gets it, that gets the reference, or goes like, this reminds me of an Argento film, where you get that opportunity to go, yes, that guy got it.
All the time.
I would get scolded. I would get scolded by our assistant editor, Janice, on Darkwing, because she would like send me a note and she'd say, what does this reference mean? What is this joke? And then I would explain it to her, and she goes, who's going to get that? Like, she actually asked me in an email one time, why do you write jokes for one person? And I said, because that one guy is really going to love it.
That's the thing, is I sometimes you got to just do stuff for you. You are making this comic for everybody, but sometimes you got to put something in there that's just going to make you smile. And if the one person out there gets it, you can give him like a fist bump or a high five and like, yeah, this guy, he's got it. He knows Argento.
People love Easter eggs.
Yeah, exactly. So like Tim puts in all of his Easter eggs. He puts in a lot of cameos of people that we know. He puts in a lot of text references. Like Tim does all those Easter egg cameos. The ones that I put in the script that I ask him to insert are really, really, they're minutia. So in Common America Volume 2, there's Kimiko, who's a Japanese character, and I have her origin story. So I put in a lot of kanji and a lot of Japanese text in there because I know Japanese, and I put that in there. But that's stuff that if also know Japanese, you're not going to be able to read that, and you're not going to be able to get it. And even if you do, some of the references in there are so obscure that, like, here, okay, I'm going to give one away because it's been like 6 months since Common America 2 came out, and not a single person has noticed it. So there's an obvious Easter egg reference that I did put in the script where Kimiko, for one panel, is on a TV show, and she's sitting in like it's a panel TV show, and two of the other guests are Hamato Yoshi and Oroku Saki from the Ninja Turtles cartoon, and I provided screen caps of what they looked like in the cartoon during the flashbacks when they were human, and that's obvious. But the kanji that's supposed to be like embedded on the TV screen, you know, of their names, you know, there's the kanji that says Kimiko Kaneko or Kaneko Kimiko because last name first, first name last in Japanese. But in the Japanese dub of the Ninja Turtles cartoon, they changed Hamato Yoshi's name because Hamato Yoshi isn't a real name in Japan. It's gibberish. So they changed it to a real name. They changed his name to Yoshihama Takeshi. So I had to look up the kanji for that, and I put that down there. Same thing with Oroku Saki. They changed, because that's not a real name in Japanese, so they changed it to Oroku Sawaki. And so I had to look up the kanji for that. So it's the authentic Japanese dub from 1987 names that are written in kanji on the page. And absolutely not a single human being on the face of the earth noticed that or brought it up. That was just for my personal entertainment.
So are you confirming that Common America is also in the same universe as TMNT?
I confirm nothing that could get me sued.
So that's fun. So we also get after these settings. I'm sorry, did we get into you, Aaron? Did you need to use settings at Boom since you were working such a wide array of writers and artists?
Oh yeah, we definitely, now granted, a lot of the stuff I was working on was Disney books, but you know, they still have their very own settings, and you know, you're doing the Muppets, obviously you need reference for the backstage area for your artists. The nice thing was, as an editor, I would take pitches from anybody. You know, there wasn't any kind of like gatekeeping or a wall. Like if you ran into me at a show and you were like, hey, I really want to write this book, I would give you my email and I'd say, send me your pitch. And then if I liked your pitch, you know, I would, you know, there's one or two things that are going to happen. Either I'm going to reject it and tell you, like, work on it. Here's some notes, work on it and get back to me. Or I'm going to, you know, tell you that I like it and I'm going to send it through to Disney. And then from that point, it's up to Disney to approve it or to give me notes to send back to you for you to work on it some more. But anybody could come to me and pitch. The thing that I was fortunate of is that everybody who was pitching to me on projects generally were not people who were just looking for work, any work. It was people who were passionate about those projects. So I had like Alan Gladfelter on Cars, and he knew that universe backwards and forwards, so I didn't have to provide him any reference.
You had Langridge on the Muppets, and he he nailed that.
Yeah, he absolutely nailed it. And then, you know, we had some other artists on the Muppets too, like, you know, Shelley Paroline, of course. You know, before we did Darkwing together, I hired James Silvani to finish off Muppet King Arthur. So, you know, there were certain references that we would give them for, you know, the time period, you know, kind of nail this, but in like a Muppety style for the fairy tales. But, you know, for the most part, everybody who was coming on the projects were super passionate about it and already knew what they wanted to do. So, but, you know, you still, every now and then, you know, you'd get an artist who'd say like, hey, you know, the writer wrote this, I don't have this, you know, like Nate Watson came to me at one point and was like, you know, hey, Jesse Snyder wrote this scene in Toy Story, and the angle that he's asking for, I don't have reference for that. You know, that angle in Andy's room. Do you know where in any of the films that happens? So I had to go through and I had to screen cap it and send it over to him. So yeah, settings are very important if you want to nail the authenticity, and especially when you're working on a licensed project, you need to nail that authenticity, because if not, you're going to get notes back and it's going to have to be redrawn. When you're working on your own creator-owned project, there's obviously some more freedom, but you know, you still want things to remain consistent within your own universe. So, you know, sometimes, you know, setting reference and things like that will be incredibly important.
So now that we've got the setting out of the way, there's also a brief synopsis of what the first three issues are going to be for this. We kind of get into the page layouts. And like I said, here's a note that names, there's an artist on the first 5 pages and a new artist on the 5 through 30. And then we start getting into the panel layouts. I imagine this is probably the most important part of the script, is the panel layouts, the page breakdowns of essentially what's happening. We can see we've got like an establishing shot, Earth floating, we got a dismembered body, and then a Ferris aircraft kind of in here. Aaron, what's your process for making your panel breakdowns? Do you have a maximum number of panels that you want per page? depending on if it's an action page, does that limit the amount of panels you can have? What's your rules as far as panels?
I try to stick to, and now see if Silvani was on here, he would laugh at this, but I try to stick to no more than 5 panels per page. There are occasions where I've given him more and I've asked for more because of the pacing of a joke or a bit or even an action sequence. So, and then it's up to him. He'll come back to me and he'll say, I can't, I'm not going to be able to do this in this many panels. Here's what I can do. And I'm sorry, the neighbor's kid is crying and distracting me. It's like yelling outside. So like you work with your artist in that way, because a lot of times I'll say this, I'll give him a panel breakdown, and I'm not really precious about my scripts. It's like Silvani likes a detailed script. Most of the artists that I've worked with like a detailed script. I find that the Marvel method is not appreciated as much outside of maybe Marvel. Most artists I've worked with want structure. They can deviate from that structure as they see fit, because they are the ones who have to tell the story visually. But they like to have that structure there so that they have a framework in which to apply their craft. So, I try to do no more than 5 panels. The one thing that you always want to remember is to, in your script, always have the first character that needs to speaking first, so that it's reinforced with the artist that character needs to be drawn in the panel first. These are all really important things because you're going to have to alter your script if you don't give them any direction. You just say, this person's talking, these 2 people are talking. And that's, in a Marvel book, that might very well happen. Like, this is a scene between Captain America and Iron Man having a conversation. And in your head, you may need Captain America to start the conversation, but if you don't give them that direction and they draw Iron Man first, well, now when you go in and you do the scripting, you're going to have to kind of alter what was in your head. With the Marvel method, that's obviously easier because you don't really have the script until you have an idea, but you don't really have the dialogue in mind until you get the pages, which I think is much faster, but I think sometimes leads to a lot more sloppiness because not everybody is good at writing dialogue on the fly just based on the pictures. I think I'm very good at it because I worked at Tokyopop, where you had this badly translated manga script sometimes, and then you had to try to make heads or tails out of it and have the characters make sense. And you had your character breakdowns from the licensee, so that you could basically keep the characters kind of consistent, unless it was a company that just didn't care. They were just like, we're licensing it to you and we don't care what you do with it, which sometimes happens. But yeah, all of that is very important. You want to make sure that your artist is able to keep as consistently with your vision as possible. But you also want to allow them the freedom to kind of like break off and give you something that's more interesting maybe than what you had in mind.
So Mark, do you have any rules of thumb, kind of when you're doing your panel breakdowns as far as how many you want on any page? Do you seem like you might be into the details. Do you sometimes micromanage Tim?
I don't micromanage him. I do include details, but I also know that, and now this is important, the more details you include in a panel, that's the more stuff the artist has to draw into that panel, which means that that panel has to be bigger. The bigger the panel is, the fewer panels you can have on a page. Also, the more visual details that you have to put into a panel means the less text you can include in the panel, such as narrative boxes and speech bubbles, because those are going to cover up all the visual details the artist is drawing. So those are all things you have to consider. If you want to have a talky page that's going to have a lot of narrative text or dialogue between characters, then you just need that to be just the characters on the panel without a whole lot of stuff going on additionally in the panel, or that's all going to get covered up by those speech bubbles. Also, it would probably be best to have fewer panels on those pages, because if the characters are just talking, then why do you need 6 panels of them just talking? That's not going to be visually interesting. And like Aaron said, I try to max my panels at 5 per page. If I go beyond 5, I feel like I'm going too far. But I also know that if I go beyond 5, then I need to have less text on the page. I'll put in notes, like if it's something that's happening in rapid succession, that's just going to be I'll put like panels 3, 4, and 5 are a 3-panel strip to illustrate rapid succession of movement, like somebody coming at a character really fast. Not going to be a lot of visuals, not a lot of details in those panels, but those panels need to be back to back or side by side to show that something's coming really fast, and these panels are happening, close together in the span of time. There's a lot of little nuances and things that you have to keep in mind so you don't frustrate your artist, because your artist will end up, if you have like, okay, I'm going to need 12 panels on this page, and I got this freaking like Bible of dialogue that all the characters have to be saying, and all this stuff has to be going on to the panel. The artist is going to look at that and go like, this guy's a moron who's never written a script in his life. There's no way for me to put this on the page. Try going and reading like the Dreamwave Transformers comic, the one that was drawn by Pat Lee and written by, I can't remember the guy's name, but there's so much, he put so much detail into the art. I don't know if it was the writer's fault or Pat Lee, the artist's fault, but dialogue boxes, because there's so much dialogue, covers up so much art and vital art that makes the story coherent, that the book's almost unreadable. Because of it, because no one planned that out in advance. So you just have to keep that in mind, is that the more panels you include, the fewer details and the fewer amounts and the less amount of text you can use. So it's kind of like a give and take.
There's nothing that's going to make your book look more amateurish than if your word balloons are covering up important details in the panel. If your word balloon is in any way cutting into a character's face or covering the other character's face that they're talking to, that immediately takes you out of the immersion of the book. When lettering is done right, when you as a writer help your letterer do their job, the lettering is letterers are like the unsung heroes of the comic industry, because when they do their job right, you don't even notice their work. It blends in, and it becomes part of the reading experience, which is sad, because letterers are a vital part of the book, and if your book doesn't have a good letterer, if your book has bad lettering in on the page, it makes it hard to read. It's immediately going to take people out of the experience, and it's not going to be fun. You want people to get lost in the book, so you want to make sure that you're giving enough room for those bubbles to exist, aside, and the art still tells the story. Nothing drives me crazier than opening a Bendis book and seeing a page that an artist has obviously labored on. Like, here's a splash, and it's, let's say it's in an airport, and they've drawn just every detail of the airport and just done this beautiful work, and then it's just covered with balloons back and forth, and all that you're really seeing is the two characters. And I'm like, well, I wish I could just push the balloons out of the way and see all the work that
you want the artist edition of that comic, right? You're like, I just want to see it without all that junk in the way.
Yeah, because Bendis is at a point where he gets to work with some top tier artists who really put in the work, and it's like, wow, it's so sad to see it just covered up with I always make the joke with Silvani that he draws beautiful pictures that I then cover up with my stupid words. And but it's true in a lot of cases. You get a lot of books where the art is gorgeous, but it's covered with a mountain of text, and you're like, man, why did this artist even bother? He could have got paid the same and just left the background blank, because it was just going to be word balloons anyway. Nothing's going to kill your artist more than not letting them draw interesting things or covering up all the interesting things that are true.
So, Mark, what if you got a nice splash page? Obviously that's not going to be so much a panel breakdown. It's more maybe a more fluid piece of action that's like the centerpiece of your action story. How do you break that down?
So for splash pages, half-page splashes, I think your artist will love you the more of those you put in there, because it's just one big panel. It makes the layout a lot easier on them too, and that's the other thing you have to consider is the more panels you want to include on a page, the more complicated that layout is going to be. Unless you expect them. A lot of the times as a writer, it's hard to visualize the layout in your head. That's really more of the artist's eye. And so a lot of the times you're thinking of these panels as just isolated squares, but that's not how they're going to look on the page, because if the artist puts your panels on the page like it's a newspaper comic strip, just these squares that are all lined up, that page is going to look really boring. It's going to look like crap. Mm-hmm. So they do very elaborate and complex and visually interesting panel layouts. But the more panels you give them, the harder that is. And then if you give them 12 panels on a page, like Stan Lee used to do, that would drive Jack Kirby crazy sometimes. Or Frank Miller would do it. That was one of his things. But you end up with these pages that just look like newspaper strips, and they're very boring to look at. As much as I like Frank Miller, I don't like his 12 panel per page thing that he enjoyed doing sometimes. Splash pages, though, make it a lot easier for the artist. And it also makes it good for the writer, because if it's a splash page, then you can put more detail into your description of what's going on that page. You still have to keep certain things in mind. It is one panel, which means that it is a snapshot. So you can only have the characters doing a single action in that panel. You can't have, if it's a splash page of Spider-Man doing something, you can't have Spider-Man doing 6 different things, because it's still one panel. But you can put other details in there. You can also put in more dialogue, as long as you sacrifice some of the details you want, depending on how much dialogue or how much text you want to include. Everyone knows like that famous splash page from, I think it's the first issue of Jim Lee's X-Men, Jim Lee and Chris Claremont, where Magneto's making his big entrance, and he's just got like 12 paragraphs of text all around him, and the other X-Men are all recoiling from him, and it's very Claremont-esque, but he sacrifices any environmental details and stuff just to get all that text on there. Splash pages are easier for the artist to draw. I think they're engaging, as long as you're, judicious with them. If every other page is a splash page, like the Image comics in the 90s were, that makes the comic read really quickly. That also makes the comic look kind of lazy. But if you do a splash page for emphasis, in the script, like it's a big moment that deserves a splash page, then that'll also help your comic read better and more dramatically. And you can do like 3/4 page splashes, where like the upper 3/4 is a big splash, and then right below it is a small like 1/4 page strip or 2 panels at the bottom that have like whatever's going on. A splash page doesn't necessarily have to be a pinup, It can be 3/4 or half the page or whatever, but you just have to keep that in mind.
Aaron, do you have a set number of splash pages that you're willing to put into like a 24-page comic book?
Generally, no more than 2 is kind of like my rule. But one thing that I want to point out is that once you kind of understand the rules of, and the limitations of of what you're doing, then you can start breaking those. When it makes sense to do so. Like, for example, we're saying no more than 5 panels per page. But, if you go and you read Watchmen, or you read, the 3 Jokers, obviously there's like 9 panels per page on a lot of those pages. So, but these are written by people who have mastered the craft. Alan Moore, obviously, Jeff Johns, they have worked in comics long enough. They know what all the rules are, and they know when and how they can break them. You've got like the Death of Superman, which is all splash pages, because it's essentially a big fight. So every one of those pages, Dan Jurgens wanted it to be impactful. So, he basically gave you like this big, each thing was one big thing. It was a quick read, but, it was impactful, and he could.
And they built up to that over like 6 issues, where like each issue had fewer panels until the second to last issue was just splash pages. And I think the last issue was 2-page spreads all the way through, or something like that, or just splash pages and 2-page spreads. But it was a slow buildup. And like you said, it was by people who have been writing so long that they know when they can stretch their rules, but they know how to stretch them.
Exactly. So, you can definitely do that. I'm sorry, Wes, what was the question? I got kind of sidetracked in talking about breaking.
Do you have a limit on the amount of splash pages that you're willing to use in like a 24-page story?
Well, I tend to try to give people more bang for their buck. So yeah, I try to only give them 2 splash pages. If I exceed 1, I always want at least 1 splash page in there, because I am a big fan of, you get that first page turn and bam, here's something impactful, or here's something, that like is interesting. In one issue we did like this, the splash page was just Darkwing waking up in bed. But the reason that we, like from a nightmare, but the reason that we did that was because we were parodying Walking Dead. And it was just it was a shot that was meant to evoke the moment when Rick wakes up in the hospital, into this new world that he's been thrust into. And so we kind of wanted to have that visual, both as a callback and because it made sense in our story, because Darkwing was going to do the exact same thing. He was walking into a situation that he was not prepared for. But I like to have that splash page as that impact that draws you into the story. Sometimes I like to have that 2-page spread. Especially like on a first issue, it's fun to have that first page of like setup, where you've got like the newscaster kind of describing, what the events are. Then you turn the page and bam, here's the events going off the rails. I always like to have at least that. And then, later in the story, if you've got like some big action sequence or some big reveal, something you're going to show like a new environment, and you really want to like establish the scene, then another splash page, another 2-page spread can be very effective. But I try not to overdo it, because I like to have more story element, more dialogue, more action in each issue, and I want to have those pages where there's more panels and more art for people to enjoy.
As a reader, it feels like if I'm getting a ton of splash pages or double page spreads, that the writer didn't have much to say, but he's trying to pad out his story. Like, is there a milestone around the corner? Is he trying to get to issue 25 or something? Why didn't he accomplish much right here, right now?
Nobody gets to issue 25 anymore. Not in this industry.
Yeah, it can be pretty frustrating. So we've kind of talked a pretty good in depth about kind of scripting and some of the do's and don'ts. As far as when your script is done, Aaron, how many times should you have it looked over and edited? Just when you think it's over.
Well, I'm an editor myself, so people are like, "Oh, that must be very convenient," that you don't have to have anybody look at your script, and I absolutely do, because when you write something, you're very close to it, and you may not see the flaws, you may not see the plot holes. I mean, how many times have you watched a movie and you're like, "Man, that didn't make any sense. Like, here's this glaring plot hole. How did they not see that?" And it's typically either from small productions where you've got like a very sloppy production, or maybe amateurish. Or sometimes it's from big directors and things like that. And it's because they've hit a point where nobody tells them no. Like as much as I like The Dark Knight Rises, there's plot holes that you can fly the Batwing through. You watch the movie and you're like, yeah, that was good. Then you get out to the parking lot afterwards. I remember like distinctly walking out of the theater and I enjoyed myself. But then when I got outside, I was like, wait a minute. And I started like going back to the story and going like, this doesn't make sense. How did this work? So, having someone else look at your script, I try and at least have 3 people that I trust, give it a once over. Then they'll give me some notes back. Then I'll send it back to them, and get their kind of feedback on the changes that I made that they pointed out. And then from there, it'll go to our letterer. He'll before that, I'll get the pages back from the artist, and I'll review that and I'll tailor my script to what they've drawn. And then I'll send it out for another round of passes from my editors, so that it's just, I want it to be as tight and as concise as possible, and I want to make sure that it's consistent with previous stories. That if I'm layering in anything that's going to be a reveal later, that we're building to it properly, and that it'll make sense. Because sometimes when you're editing something, you not only have to look at that book, that current issue or that current book that you're on, you have to go back and look what the previous issues were saying, to make sure that it's consistent and to make sure that all those lines are going to connect. Because once you're past the monthly stage, if you're doing monthly books, obviously not all of us are. Once you're past that stage, people go back and they read the trade, or they go back and they revisit several trades. They're like, I want to read that whole big storyline all in a row, and they start going through it. That connective tissue has to make sense, because if not, the readers will find it and they'll tell you.
So, Mark, obviously you're on crowdfunding projects. You guys have been very successful. Do you have to earmark some of that budget to get professional editors, or do you send it out to people that in the industry? How do you get your books edited after your scripts get finished?
Tim and I edit each other. So like Aaron said, it's really important to have a second set of eyes look at whatever you're doing, even if you're writing prose. Like, I am really bad at missing my typos. I can reread my manuscript 10 times, but because I know the rhythm of the words in my head, it's almost like I'm reading it blind. And so I'll miss my typos all the time. And that's why I always want another person to look at it. But for me, Tim is my other person, and vice versa. I'm the other person that goes over his stuff. So when I finish a script and I send the first draft to Tim, he gives me back his notes, and then I adapt it for a second draft. By that point, the second draft is very minor because we already agreed on everything in the page breakdown section. But I do that second draft, and then I send that back to him. But then he will do running changes, running edits that occur to him as he's drawing. He'll notice a problem where it was fine. It looked fine when he was reading it, but when he actually gets down to trying to draw the scene, there might be a problem. Like recently, and I can't give any spoilers, but we have Black Ops X Common America coming out this summer, and Tim is almost done with it. But he got to a big scene. There's this 2-page dialogue scene that had too much dialogue, and so he was like, Mark, can you trim the dialogue and the number of panels back for this scene? And he gave me like what he felt was, this is the core of the conversation. Can you whittle it down to just this core topic? And so I rewrote the dialogue and I restructured the panels and I gave that back to him, and now Tim's drawing that scene. But that's the kind of like running, thing edits he'll give back to me is if he hits a stumbling block while trying to draw something, he won't know that stumbling block is there until he actually gets to that page and realizes, okay, I'm trying to draw this, it's not working. Mark, this is the problem. Can you help me fix it so I draw it correctly? That kind of thing.
So
but it
the
is really
script
important.
is a living document.
Exactly. And I know that's difficult in some parts of the industry where people or artist and writer might be separated or things like that. But it really does help. And it's the same thing. And I know we're getting close to hitting the 1 hour mark, but one thing I did want to point out that I do specifically that helps me with dialogue and text as it appears on the page when I'm writing my script is I noticed that in the example from Jeff Johns is that he puts the dialogue all formatted over to the left, and then he just puts it all in like a paragraph. What I do when I format my script is I center the dialogue on the word page, and I imagine that the dialogue is in an imaginary speech bubble. And then I keep all the text centered, and as I type it out, I'm like, how big is this going to look on the page as a speech bubble? And if I'm writing too much, and that thing just looks humongous, I'm like, okay, that's too much. And so I try to trim it down. And I can't help it. I'm a writer. Sometimes I just don't trim it down enough. It's like I never seem to ever trim it down enough. And so that's usually Tim's #1 edit when he's going through the lettering process is he has to trim down my dialogue, just cut out some words here and there to make it fit. But I find that centering the dialogue text on the page and imagining that it's in a speech bubble helps you, at least in the first pass, to trim your wordiness down. That's something Bill Williams actually taught us. He said 25 words or less, preferably less, and then doing the centering the text and using the imaginary speech bubble method at least gives you an idea to stop yourself when you're writing too much.
You know what's funny is I've edited Bill on Punchline, and I really enjoy the collaborative process with Bill. And I've actually told him on occasion that he goes too far in the opposite direction, where he's so concerned about like trimming down the script that I'm like I'll suggest a dialogue change, and I'll be like, I added more here because I feel like you're conveying the information, but you also want to convey the character's personality more. In this moment, you could really, kind of like give the reader more information just in the way that they deliver it. And so, yeah, sometimes it's possible too to trim it back too much.
I've done that too, where when Tim sends me back the PDF proof that has a lettering in it, I've noticed that he's extended some of my dialogue because he's like, well, you didn't really write enough here. I'm like I can never make you happy. It's either too much or too little. So sometimes you can second guess yourself. You can get paranoid, like, oh my God, am I writing too much? It's okay to write for the edit and then to trim it down. That's not a big problem. You'll just have to work. If you have a separate person lettering, like Tim is the artist and the letterer, so that makes it easy for me because it's just one person I got to talk to. If you've got a second person lettering, then you want to talk to them and see what's working, what isn't in the lettering process. But yeah, that's basically what it comes down to. Yeah, you can second guess yourself. Sometimes it's better to put too much and then trim it down. But that could piss off your letterer because then that's twice as much work as they've got to do. But
I had an ex that told me something once about fashion that I actually applied to writing. She said that like fashion magazines would tell you to put on all the jewelry you wanted to wear when you were going out, and then remove at least one thing because you had a tendency to overdo it, to put too much on there. And I always thought that was really interesting, and I started applying that to writing. I was like, in your initial script pass, just dump everything that you want into the dialogue. And then as you do your second pass, go through and start saying, okay, what are the points that I need to make? How much of this can I trim? And just bring it back and make it really concise. And so that's kind of like how I do it in my first pass. And then even once I get the art, I'll start trimming things out because I'm like, okay, so the way that this is drawn, I'm gonna need the word balloon to be about this size. And this is just something that you learn with time is you can kind of eyeball it. You can eyeball the art and know whether or not your dialogue is gonna fit. So, you can start trimming it down so that you reduce that profile. So once the letterer gets to it, you know that you're not going to have to ask them to make a lot of adjustments, because obviously that's more work for them, and you want to take care of your letterer because they're so important. You want to give them the least amount of work to do, so that there's not, and you're not going to delay your book because you're not going to be having that back and forth. There's nothing worse than like getting your lettering draft back and then basically asking your letterer to redo the book because you didn't pre-plan or you didn't.
Yeah, they've already stressed and worked their hardest to fit all that dialogue and text on the page, and then you send it back to them, and you're like, okay, I'm going to rewrite the script and basically just going to have to do the job all over again to make it. Yeah, that's going to tick off your letterer. When Tim sends me the PDF proofs that has the lettering on it, mostly my suggestions usually aren't even about the script itself, because Tim's made his own extractions if he's needed to, and I can give him feedback on that. It's lettering placement. Now, I don't know if you want to do a video on lettering specifically, Wes. I mean, I'm not a letterer. Aaron, you're not a letterer, right?
No,
not professionally.
I mean, obviously, but yeah, I haven't done the nuts and bolts of the lettering.
So I think it really just comes down to when I get the PDF proof back from Tim, I don't have my script next to me. I read it like I'm the consumer reading the comic, and if it reads well. And so the feedback I give Tim on lettering is just all down to readability. If the dialogue boxes are properly placed so that you're reading them in the proper sequence, if it's at all confusing what the dialogue box sequence is on the page, if it's confusing me, the writer, then it will confuse the consumer who's reading it for the first time blind. So I give those notes back to Tim. Sometimes it can be something as like, well, take this box and, swap it around so that it reads, 1, 2, 3, 4 a lot easier. Sometimes I recommend like, okay, maybe add like, I call it piping from one dialogue box to the next. And that's basically the trail of breadcrumbs that the reader's eye will follow from one speech bubble to the next. And it's kind of a cheat, but it makes 100% sure that the reader is reading the dialogue boxes of the speech bubbles in the intended sequence, things like that. And we don't do that all the time, but only if we're having trouble with the layout and that kind of thing.
Well, fellas,
but lettering,
we're kind of up against the time here. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll stop it. I think I made my point.
Absolutely. I think we've had a great discussion, kind of about, script formats, the scripting process. You got to go through and do your edits and everything. Just some things to keep in mind when you're doing the scripting as far as dialogue. Now that we've done kind of the technical stuff, we've done our brainstorm, we've done our paginations, we've done our layout, or our overview. Now we've got our script kind of going. That was time to do the more creative stuff. We're going to start developing heroes, villains. We're going to start talking about writing dialogue, building tension, drama. Also finding artists. I think that's going to be an interesting topic. Some of those kind of things. That's what you can be looking for in the days and the weeks and months ahead. So I want to say thank you very much to Mark Pellegrini, obviously from Common America fame, and Aaron Sparrow from Darkwing Duck in Tokyopop. Thank you guys for joining me. And this will basically do it for this part of the foundation laying. It's on to more interesting things in the future, and we will see you next time.
See ya.